Hello, I'm Kevin Pollak. Yes, that Kevin Pollak. What's that? I did save room for pie, thank you. And may I offer you a slice of my new comedy podcast? It's called Alchemy This. I've gathered 5 hilarious improvisers, and each episode I set the scene, and the comedy gold fills your life with undeniable joy. Be the first to yell at your friends about Kevin Pollak's new comedy podcast, Alchemy This. Listen and subscribe at Apple Podcasts or on the iHeartRadio app, or wherever you listen to podcasts.
Apple. The name is synonymous with sleek, sexy technology.
But before this company with undeniable appeal became the first American public company to hit $1 trillion in value, its future wasn't so certain.
From ousting a co-founder to fighting off feature creep, the company found itself in a precarious position.
And that spurned co-founder would return to pull Apple back from the brink.
So today we're tackling a really huge topic, a company that actually has multiple incidents in its history that you could argue is the brink. But this time we're really looking at Apple and the experience of Steve Jobs being pushed out of the company and then returning to
pulled back in.
to save this company from the brink of bankruptcy.
To do that, let's just briefly talk about Apple's history.
Sure. So you got a couple of phone freaks. That's what they called people who, they were essentially like hackers, except instead of hacking computers, they were hacking the phone system.
Yes.
And using various devices and methodologies to get free phone calls. And you had 2 Steves. You had Wozniak and Jobs. And between the two of them, Wozniak was the engineer and Jobs was the marketing genius.
Yes.
They decided to found their own company. They were both members of like a home brewing computer club in California. And they decided, hey, we could probably make our own computers and sell them to people. So April 1st, April Fool's Day, 1976, almost 1 year to the day after the founding of Microsoft, they founded Apple.
Yes, with $1,300.
Yes. The very first Apple computer, you can actually see pictures of the Apple I. No one ever talks about it because only a few were ever sold.
Well, it was made for Wozniak's Hobbyist Club.
Yeah, exactly.
So.
It wasn't meant for the general public. This was back in a time where the people who were buying personal computers were computer nerds. And I use that term affectionately. I consider myself a computer nerd.
Yes.
But this was not meant for the average person's living room or anything like that. The cases were made, like the original Apple I, there are cases of it where it was made in wood, like a big wooden case holding all the electronics. Some, they would just send the electronics to you and you would put it all together and you would make a case yourself. So very early design, but they knew immediately that they were going to have to go back to the drawing board, make a new version, and try and cater that to a broader audience.
Yes. So they made the Apple II. So Apple I had no mouse and no keyboard. And Apple II, I'm guessing maybe had those things, but
well, they had the keyboard. The Apple II. So
they had the keyboard.
The Apple II was this was before they had graphical user interfaces in personal computers. So it was all command line. That meant that you had to type in all of this stuff.
I remember.
They did have color graphics. I think it could show up to 8 whole colors.
Ooh.
It was primitive, obviously, compared to today's standards, but it was a computer that started to catch on. And then Jobs would go and start looking for some mentors to help him grow this company and go from a essentially 2-man operation out of your stereotypical garage in California to a real company of decent size.
Yeah, and he found Mike Markula, who was a retired engineer and marketing manager for Intel, and he came on, he bought a third of the company.
Yep.
And kind of helped them turn their little garage business into
a real thing.
A real thing.
Yeah. And they hired on Regis McKenna to do some advertising, who he was the guy who actually designed the original Apple logo.
Yes.
And before long, they were doing quite well considering that this is the birth of the home computer industry.
Yeah. And then in 1980, they go public and they sold 4.6 million shares at $22 a pop and sold them all in just minutes.
Yep. They released the Apple III, but there were a lot of problems with it. A lot of chips were not seated properly in that machine, and so it experienced a lot of failures.
Yeah, they were worried about the Apple II getting out of date, and so they kind of forewent a lot of their Q&A process.
They rushed it, and because, obviously everyone's thinking, well, computers, they get obsolete pretty quickly. As it turns out, the Apple II line would be one of the longest running lines of computers. Now, they had different versions. There was like the Apple II, the Apple IIe, the Apple II GS, et cetera. But they got a lot of mileage out of that.
Whereas the Apple III was discontinued in just a few years.
Yep. So 1981, they release 2.6 million more shares of stock. They sell out. And they also had to deal with the fallout of the Apple III not succeeding in the market so well, which meant there were layoffs. That's what I mean with dealing with the fallout.
Yes. Markula became president and Jobs became chairman. And they released a lot of new software, like 40 programs or so.
1982, they've been in business 6 years. They become the first personal computer company to make $1 billion in sales. Now, that's in sales, not in profit, but still $1 billion. That's enormous.
Yes.
650,000 computers sold by the company at that point.
Yes. But then IBM beats out Apple for personal computers in Europe. So
yeah, the writing was on the wall here. So Apple was still trying to develop the next big thing in computers. One of them was a project that Steve Jobs himself was headed, and that was called Lisa. Lisa was named after Jobs' daughter. No one remembers the Lisa either because, one, it was incredibly expensive.
Yes.
Very few people could afford it. And two, it had pretty limited software because since no one could afford to buy one, software developers had no reason to make software for it. Like, well, no one's going to buy it because there aren't enough computers out there.
Yes, but it did have a mouse.
It did. It did have a mouse. So this was after Steve Jobs had a visit to Xerox PARC. And over at Xerox, they had been showing off the mouse and graphical user interface for a decade.
Yes.
And he essentially took those ideas and ran with them. Yeah.
Yes, he did. And in 1983, Jobs brings in John Sculley to be Apple's president. He had previously been the CEO of Pepsi.
1984, that's when you get the iconic commercial from Apple that was advertising the Macintosh computer. I remember that commercial. It was modeled to remind you of George Orwell's novel, 1984. And it was this dark, foreboding, dystopian kind of hallway with a bunch of people dressed in very drab clothes. It's lit in this blue-gray lighting, and they all file into this big auditorium to watch this giant screen. And then occasionally it cuts to this woman wearing a white tank top and red shorts, which were Apple's colors, running down a hallway carrying a big freaking hammer. And then she hurls the hammer at the screen, crashing it. And Apple's like, "What's up, IBM? We're coming for you."
Sup.
I'm paraphrasing.
No, you are. They sold these Macintosh computers for about $2,500.
Yes, they're a very expensive computer.
But they sold 70,000 of them in the first 100 days, which is not too bad.
Yeah, the Apple II was still their top-selling computer and would be for quite some time. But the Macintosh was able to make some success where the Lisa had failed. However, by this time, Steve Jobs was kind of on thin ice because we've probably heard stories about Steve Jobs and his managerial style.
Yes.
Being difficult might be a nice way of putting it, but he had kind of rubbed people the wrong way on the Lisa project. And then he decided to adopt the Macintosh project once he was pulled off of that, and he began to rub people the wrong way on the Macintosh project. The original concept for the Macintosh was that it was going to be a low-cost computer, but Jobs' involvement changed that dramatically. And this whole time, he was starting to alienate people, and it wasn't just some of the engineers who were getting alienated. John Sculley was really not pleased either.
Yeah, no. The company infighting and overproduction and stuff like that was a big problem. So Jobs, there's obviously this tension. Jobs tries to oust Sculley, and Sculley tries to oust Jobs.
Yeah, and ultimately Sculley would win this fight. So essentially, the way the story tends to be told is that Steve Jobs just found himself essentially removed from all projects. So he had nothing to do. He was coming to Apple, but he was not allowed to work on anything. And that his office space was literally moved to the outskirts of the Apple campus.
Jeez.
And so he was essentially being put in the closet and told not to do anything. And so some stories say he was fired. Some stories say he resigned. But effectively, he was told he wasn't welcome there anymore, and he walks away.
In 1985.
Yep. And he would go on to found a totally different company.
And Scully did some reorganization and caused Apple to have some growth and move into the business market.
And then things took a turn for the worse.
They did.
So Steve Jobs, he goes and founds another company called Next. As for Apple, well, we'll find out what happens to them next. But first, let's take a quick break to thank our sponsor.
Investigators have been desperate to figure out how that family flew off that cliff in California and whether it was on purpose.
Early the morning of March 26th, rescue workers rappelled down the cliff, where they lifted the dead bodies of 3 children.
I'm to the point where I no longer am calling this an accident, I'm calling it a crime.
Who are these women, and how did they come to adopt 6 children, 2 sets of 3 Black siblings?
They were one of my early role models for what like a non-traditional family could look like.
We looked up to her like, wow, she's the best parent in the world. We're horrible.
I know how can I help you?
Yeah, there's some kids that I feel is being highly abused.
She was eating out of the garbage. Like, something's not right about this.
But since she's told me about it, I just can't live with it. I'm very concerned for these kids.
From Glamour and How Stuff Works, this is Broken Hearts.
Listen and subscribe at Apple Podcasts or on the iHeartRadio app or wherever you listen to podcasts.
Okay, so Steve Jobs has been forced out of the company. Things continue more or less on a good track for Apple for the next couple of years. And then 1988, things start to go, well, I was going to say sour, but we're talking about Apple.
Pear-shaped? They start going pear-shaped.
That's better. I like that better.
So, yeah, a couple of things happened in 88. Apple bought a bunch of memory chips. They thought there was going to be a shortage.
So they go and buy a bunch of chips at full price to stock up on these.
And then the prices drop.
So they then have overpaid for chips and there's no shortage to be found. So they then increase the prices on Macintosh computers, which were already expensive computers on the market. Apple products have always been kind of geared toward people of more means.
Yes.
Almost to the point of luxury products.
Yes.
And so part of that was that has much higher profit margins, right? You can sell these things for much more than they cost to build and you make more money. But that became such a point of focus that the business overall began to suffer.
Yeah, people said, I'm not paying those prices for buying computers for people for the holidays. I'm just going to buy an Apple III.
Yeah. This device that nobody really wanted.
And then they make some upper-end models for business. IBM is doing the same thing.
And they go through some reorganization. They go into a company that now has 4 major divisions, which are built into 3 regions and then products. Yeah,
yes.
So you got USA, Europe, the Pacific, and then products. And depending on who you were, you might think that the changes were really, really great for the company, and other people said, I'm out of here.
Yeah.
I'm putting on my walking shoes.
And then in 1989, Apple got hit with some lawsuits.
From Xerox.
For stealing their stuff.
Yeah, oddly enough, Xerox was suing someone for copying them.
Oh.
That was a copier joke.
I got it.
Okay.
But here's the crazy thing. Apple won that lawsuit because you can't apparently copyright look and feel of a product.
Yeah. So this was one of those things where I guess we should be thankful that copyright was narrowed in focus. Otherwise, if you happen to make something that just looks kind of like someone else, or someone else's product, but isn't clearly infringing on it, you don't want to get hit by a frivolous lawsuit. So in 1990, they start releasing lower-priced computer models, which move. People want them. But again, that profit margin, if you're selling a computer closer to the amount that it costs you to make it, obviously you're not making as much money per sale. So that did not create a great incentive for Apple. That's, again, why they really focused on those more expensive computers.
And another problem is you've got these companies who all have PCs. Since Macs were, even the cheaper ones are still kind of expensive, they wouldn't work with the PCs.
Right. The PC software won't run on a Macintosh computer.
The company would have to, on the business end, replace everything if they wanted to switch over to Macs.
Yeah, so they were having a real hard time getting any kind of traction in the corporate world.
In 1994, they came out with the Power Macintosh.
Yep.
And it was a huge demand.
Way more than what they anticipated.
Yeah, because previously they had overestimated demand of some of their products. And so Spindler tried to make up for that. And they ended up having $1 billion worth of undelivered orders.
Yikes.
And their stock dropped quite a bit, and Spindler was forced out in 1995.
And then you have Gil Amelio, who came in to take over in 1996. Amelio is kind of a tragic figure in our story.
He is.
He came in at a rough time, and things only got rougher, and then he got kicked to the curb, spoiler alert. So he had to find a way to make Apple more profitable, which frequently means the first step is to cut some of those costs. And cutting costs almost always includes laying off employees. Yeah, so he had to do rounds of layoffs. He had to deal with some other bureaucratic problems. And this was at a time when the company was really hemorrhaging money. So it was of critical importance. Meanwhile, as this is going on, internally in Apple, you had a division of developers who were busy at work trying to create the next version of the Mac operating system. And I'm not going to get super technical here because I know
tech stuff guy.
Yeah, our editor will yell at me if I do, justifiably. The problem was that they were developing this new operating system. They really wanted to overhaul the operating system they had been using for the Macintosh because they had just been making sort of incremental improvements. They wanted to make something truly revolutionary. But feature creep started to come in. People kept on changing the scope of what the operating system was supposed to do, which would change the demands on the hardware, and the whole thing spiraled out of control. Amelio comes in and he essentially inherits this problem.
Yes.
He's given a presentation of what's going on and he says, this is unacceptable. We cannot do this. We need to solve this problem now. And unfortunately, I don't think we can solve it with the people we have here. We're going to look outside the company and find an operating system out there on the market that we think will work with our products, and we'll go with that. And he looks around and he sees one company that seems to have an operating system that could be the future of Macintosh. That company is a company called Next, which had as its founder
Steve Jobs.
Yes. So Gil Amelio, a couple of CEOs down the road from when Jobs was forced out, comes in and says, we're going to have to acquire this company Next, and the deal is for a $337 million acquisition deal. And as part of it, Steve Jobs would come over as a consultant to work with them.
By that time, they had lost about $1 billion. And Steve Jobs went to the board of directors once Amelio brought him in and said that Amelio had to go.
Yep. So out goes Amelio. Jobs going over his head in this case. So Steve Jobs, being the big man that he is, says, you know what? Don't worry. I can run this ship for a little while you try and find a permanent CEO, and he becomes the interim CEO.
Yes.
That would be an interim CEO until he became the permanent CEO.
Yes, and he made a new board with a bunch of movers and shakers like Bill Campbell of Intuit and Larry Ellison of Oracle, for an example.
Apple launched a new ad campaign. They were trying to kind of reposition themselves as a new company that adhered back to the old philosophy of Apple. And he also reached out to an unlikely collaborator.
He reached out to Bill Gates at Microsoft.
Yeah, it's one of those things where Apple and Microsoft clearly had a rivalry going for a long time. In fact, you could argue they still do, because Microsoft was making the operating system that the IBM clones were all running on, because Microsoft made Windows. A lot of people argued that Windows was a copy of Mac OS, although really they were both copies of a Xerox operating system. Jobs would introduce this deal at a presentation by putting up Bill Gates on video. boy, howdy, did it get a reaction.
Yeah, people booed it. People are real big Apple. Like if you're an Apple devotee, you're.
It was like seeing that Steve Jobs had made a deal with Mephistopheles.
Yeah, but Jobs said, he didn't really care about that because he was doing what was right for the company. He wasn't trying to win a popularity contest. Apple gets $150 million worth of investment from Microsoft.
Mm-hmm. Microsoft starts to look a little bit better. It had been going through its own struggles at the time. And part of this was probably a little bit of helping Microsoft improve its public image. But you also saw some real collaboration in this part. And, a lot of people say that without that deal, Apple might have folded. Because in retrospect, a lot of people say that when Jobs came in, essentially he saved the company. But time doesn't work that fast. It actually took quite some time for this turnaround to happen. And a lot of people point to this moment where Jobs was able to reach out to Bill Gates and get that investment from Microsoft as the lifeline that Apple needed in order to have the freedom to turn things around.
Yeah, and I mean, Apple still had some money at that point, but they were hemorrhaging it. So Microsoft got no non-voting shares of Apple and agreed to support Office for the Macintosh for 5 years. And Apple dropped the lawsuit they had against Microsoft, claiming they were copying them.
Yep. So things got smoothed out a little bit between the two companies. Meanwhile, Jobs got to work over at Apple. And by getting to work, he started scaling back, actually. He thought that the company had diversified too far into various computer products that got further away from their strengths, like printers and things like that.
Scanners, Xerox type stuff. Yeah, they went down from 19 products to 4.
Yeah, he said by reducing this down to 4 products, we can become the absolute best in making those 4 things and stop diluting our focus onto these other things. So at this point, he has laid off around 3,000 people. They closed down some of the fabrication plants that were existed in Apple. They did a reorganization of executives because obviously Jobs wanted people working in the departments who would be loyal to him and would share his vision. And they also got to work on a super secret project.
But we'll talk about that after a brief word from our sponsor.
Without new evidence or additional evidence, they're dead in the water.
In 2004, in a tiny Ozark town, a young woman named Rebecca Gould was brutally murdered. Nearly 15 years later, her killer is still on the loose.
Potential suspects work everywhere, so we could have already talked to the killer. Right. It's just really surreal that they're out and walking around,
Like, I don't mention so much because I'm like scared.
People just seem to die around her.
I left Arkansas, became an investigator, and now I'm coming back with my team to finally get justice for Rebecca.
There's 2 guys out there.
You ready?
Yep.
Take a deep breath, dude.
I'm Katherine Townsend, and this is Hell and Gone.
Catch new episodes by subscribing at Apple Podcasts or on the iHeartRadio app or wherever you listen to podcasts.
So, Apple has really made its name in the personal computer business, but at this point when Steve Jobs has taken back over, some things begin to change at Apple. One of the things started to reflect things that Steve Jobs had thought were important from the beginning, which involved aesthetics, not just the specifications of a computer, but the design, how it actually looked. And one of the most important people at Apple to help define this is a guy named Johnny Ive. Now, Sir Johnny Ive. He's got a knighthood. But he is credited with coming up with some of the most iconic product designs, including stuff like the iPhone.
Yes. But first, the iMac.
Yes, which was those very colorful all-in-one computers. They look like a television set that had like a big CRT television set.
Yeah, and they had no floppy drive, and they did have easy internet access, and they didn't really work with previous accessories for Macintosh computers. And I worked for a while as a daycare teacher.
Yeah.
And we got one of these for our office. And growing up, a Commodore Amiga PC girl.
Using command lines and stuff like that.
Using this Apple computer was no fun for me. Whenever it broke down or froze up, I felt like there was nothing I could do. I used to say that the handle, and maybe I heard this from somebody else, but the handle on top of the iMac was so that you could pick it up easily and throw it out the window when you got frustrated.
And that little pinwheel would just stop turning, and it would just stop.
It killed me. This is probably why I'm an Android girl.
However, while it might have killed Ariel, it was killing it in the sales.
Yes, it was.
In 1998, Apple posts a $300 million profit, quite a turnaround from the company that was in a dangerous place just a couple of years earlier.
And that doubled in 1999 to $601 million.
In 2000, Steve Jobs would officially become the permanent CEO of Apple, no longer interim. And in 2001, we get to the product that I really think cemented Apple's place. It was the one that more than any of the Macs, the iMacs, any of those, I think this is what gave Apple the pathway to becoming $1 trillion company.
Yeah, it was the iPod.
The iPod, which is not the first MP3 player. Other MP3 players had come out before it, but Apple is not known as a company that pioneers a new technology. Typically, the iPhone aside, I would argue the iPhone kind of is a pioneering product because there were so few smartphones for consumers. What Apple is really good at doing is recognizing a form factor, putting its own spin on it, and then convincing people this is what you want.
Yes.
And I say that with all due respect because I think most Apple products are really, really good. And it might not be exactly what you wanted when you started out, but Apple's also very good at convincing you otherwise. And the iPod is a great example of that. You had this approach to creating an MP3 player that was very intuitive, even back in the click wheel days. It only got better as it went along. It was what helped cement Apple as a true electronics company. They diversified from computers, they grew their business, and suddenly they said, if we make things along these lines, we can make more money, we can strengthen our company without diluting our focus too much. That, I think, more than anything else, is what really saved Apple.
It was really a collaborative innovation technique.
Yeah.
And then in 2002, they acquire a few companies, they expand their stores overseas, and they get an Emmy for technology.
Yep. And in 2003, they made a deal with the 5 big record labels to allow Apple to sell music from those record labels in their brand new iTunes store. They released software where you could rip music from a CD and you could take that music and then transfer it to your iPod, but you couldn't just purchase digital music. Apple really began to set the tone and changed the music industry as a result. Like the way albums are even designed, like as in the way the songs are constructed has changed because of Apple. And the fact that we call them podcasts is because of the iPod. Even though you would argue the iPod's not really that big of a thing anymore because our smartphones can do it, it changed everything. And without the iPod, I don't think they would have had the foundation for other products like the iPhone,
which came out in 2007,
or the iPad,
which came out in 2010.
And it was only because of that, because of the iPod, that the company was able to go forward with those other products. So you could argue the 2 big Brink moments here were bringing Steve Jobs back, which then led to clearing house, and then also creating this opportunity by putting in a risk and going in a new direction with electronics. Apple has never been the biggest player as far as market share goes in the computer space.
No.
It has improved since the dark days of Apple when it was getting down into the low single digits of percentages. But unless you were in an industry like video editing or audio editing, where Macintosh computers were kind of the standard, unless you were in those fields, you were far more likely to run into a PC than a Mac. The iPod was able to change things around. And in 2011, we had the sad event of Steve Jobs passing away.
Due to pancreatic cancer.
He had been fighting cancer for a decade, and he took a medical leave from Apple and stepped down as CEO. Tim Cook became the CEO, and then Steve Jobs passed away.
We started off with a brief look at how it started. Now we're going to look at where it is now. Currently, Apple is worth more than $800 billion.
So yeah, they were at $1 trillion briefly. Now they're still hovering around there. They could be back over $1 trillion before you know it.
It changes so quickly.
And they've sold more than 200 million iPods since the launch of the product. They've sold more than 500 million iPhones. And then the iPad, which anyone who's listened to tech stuff knows, I thought the iPad was going to be a huge flop. Nope.
No.
They've sold quite a few of those.
Yes, 200 million of those as well.
Yep.
And this isn't really important, but they're coming out with a new iOS release real soon as of recording this. And in that are 77 new emojis, some of which are redheads. Which have been, like, I couldn't ever emoji myself before.
Yeah.
I mean, I won't be able to now because I don't have an iPhone, but...
Well, that is the Brink moment we wanted to focus on here. I mean, again, we could be revisiting Apple several times. There are individual products within Apple that you could argue have their own Brink moments. The Macintosh is a great example. And maybe we will revisit those in the future. But this was one of those iconic stories we really wanted to dive into because the simplified version of Steve Jobs came back and saved the company does a big disservice to how complicated that story actually was. So I hope you guys enjoyed this. We will be coming back with another company, maybe one that doesn't even start with the letter A in our next episode. Until next time, I've been Jonathan Strickland.
And I've been Ariel Caston.
Hey, that starts with an A. If you would like to learn more about what we've talked about, as well as keep track of all of our episodes, make sure you visit our website at thebrinkpodcast.show.
Or you can email us at feedback@thebrinkpodcast.show.
Without new evidence or additional evidence, they're dead in the water.
In 2004, in a tiny Ozark town, a young woman named Rebecca Gould was brutally murdered. Nearly 15 years later, her killer is still on the loose. Potential suspects work everywhere, so we could have already talked to the killer. It's just really surreal that they're out and walking around, you know,
Why I don't mention so much because I'm like scared.
People just seem to die around her.
I left Arkansas, became an investigator, and now I'm coming back with my team to finally get justice for Rebecca.
There's 2 guys out there.
You ready?
Yep.
Take a deep breath, dude.
I'm Katherine Townsend, and this is Hell and Gone. Catch new episodes by subscribing at Apple Podcasts or on the iHeartRadio app or wherever you listen to podcasts.